Nice. Yes, I did get a haircut. I apologize for the unfortunate shape of my head today. If you were to ask most people what their favorite first-person shooter game on the N64 was, most would answer GoldenEye. A game with the backing of the familiarity of the James Bond IP, being based off the 1995 film of the same title. A smaller subset of those asked, though, would likely mention another game, Perfect Dark. Now, the interesting thing here is that those who said they like GoldenEye, most have either never played or never even heard of Perfect Dark, whereas those who have played it are the ones who point to it. Nobody who's played both games doesn't prefer Perfect Dark. Why is that? Well, because Perfect Dark is what GoldenEye would be if it were finished. Sadly though, GoldenEye is the game that everyone remembers. It's the one that nostalgia favors. James Bond has always had the public's support, and so of course it aided in driving the popularity of the game. Much like Blade Runner, from which this game draws inspiration, it initially had a murky reception. It failed to market itself effectively. But now many have begun creating retrospectives on Perfect Dark, and most agree that it has stood the test of time. 17 years since its release, however, many gamers don't even know about it. People seem uninterested in it for some reason. So today we aim to give Perfect Dark the recognition it deserves, as a truly innovative piece of software and as an impressively well-produced piece of entertainment, comparing it against GoldenEye. Then we'll discuss some of the driving forces behind its low sales, and after that we'll finish with some final thoughts about its impact on gaming. Now before we begin, I just want to address one thing. The footage you'll be seeing throughout this video comes from emulated gameplay. Aside from being able to capture it at a higher resolution, there are some other reasons I captured the footage this way. Yes though, I do have a copy of the game, it's right here, and yes, I do have an N64 expansion pack, it's right there. We'll talk about why I'm playing like this more in the second part of the video though. The only reason I'm pointing it out now is that you may observe some graphical issues from time to time, as well as a lack of lens flares that were originally featured in the game. This is a result of the emulation, so I just wanted to clear that up. So for those of you who don't know, Perfect Dark was made by the same people who made GoldenEye, and in a way is a successor to it. As a matter of fact, it began its life as another James Bond game. The designers, however, had grown tired of James Bond and the restrictions it implied. Losing the bid for the licensed game ended up allowing them to pursue more creative ideas they had. And you can tell by the goofy names in the end credits that they really enjoyed themselves here. This project was their baby. James Bond belongs to James Bond, but Perfect Dark belonged to these people. So earlier I said that Perfect Dark is what GoldenEye would be if it were finished. That wasn't entirely true though. Not only does Perfect Dark do everything that GoldenEye does, but better, it also adds new features and mechanics into the base that was established with the James Bond game. They had already produced the go-to FPS. Where do you go from there? One of the first thoughts was to change the primary gameplay element of the game, the shooting. I mean, think of how lame of an impact realism has on guns. You want to be able to do as many things as you can in a game, but pulling a trigger always does the same thing. It's actually a really lame gameplay mechanic. Their idea was to add secondary functions to each weapon in the game, essentially doubling the actions available to players. This was something that just wouldn't have made sense in the James Bond world. They came up with many interesting ideas for weapons and gadgets. It became very technology focused, so somewhere down the line the creative direction focused on sci-fi. The plot revolved around aliens, secret conspiracies, AI, super weapons, assassination. It was bananas. The developers from all disciplines were given total creative freedom. They produced everything in-house, from writing and voice acting to music and motion capture. Just after the game was planned out, a large portion of the team left, making the development environment even looser, especially when new employees were brought in, finally outnumbering the team that worked on GoldenEye by triple and creating a space where creativity could just run rampant. As one developer put it, people would just do things they thought were cool and would work. They were building things in a non-production-led environment. There was no schedule, there were no managers. Even the team leader got appointed that position sort of randomly as a result of everyone leaving. If this game hadn't had so much of its behavioral assets copied over from GoldenEye, and if they hadn't already outlined the creative vision of the product, this probably would have been the end of it. But because it was an extension of GoldenEye, and because they already planned out the entire game before everyone left, it survived. Anyways, diving into the game, there's a lot to look at, so let's start with the single-player missions. Unlike modern FPS game levels that are kind of play-as-you-go, mostly having forward progression be the main challenge, each level of Perfect Dark was like a puzzle to solve, with guns, obviously. Rather than just following objective markers or walking a straight path, you'd drop into a place and have stuff to do. You'd have to complete these objectives, sometimes in any desired order, before completing the level. The game's levels and challenges were, as a result, very trial and error based. Oftentimes, you'd do something accidentally and watch the game tell you that you failed an objective, prompting you to restart. However, what was really cool was that it didn't just end the level then and there. As a matter of fact, the only way to reach a game over screen screen was to run out of health. Even after failing a mission, the game allowed you to stay in the level, exploring and completing other objectives, just unable to win. So it's not falsely difficult or anything. I mean, every objective solution is hinted at well enough that you really have no one to blame but yourself for failing. But even if you do, the game allows you to continue and prepare yourself for your next attempt. Unlike reset difficulty systems like reset platforming or Dark Souls slowly incrementing progression with resets, allowing you to peek ahead at what the game has in store next mitigates the frustration felt by players in typical trial and error setups. When you accidentally kill a mission critical character, you didn't just fail, you learned. Learning is progression. So you didn't just take a step backwards like you would have if this were an FPS like COD, but you took a step forward towards your understanding of what it takes to complete this level. Now, for these sorts of puzzle elements to fit into the game, objective statuses needed to be clearly presented to the player. If you fail, the game needs to make it very clear that you won't be able to finish it. Even when you make a mistake unknowingly, for example, using an item before its intended use. In this one level, you're given some explosive weapons. Ahead, they're needed to blow up a wall. But if you've already spent their ammo, the game is able to recognize your inability to progress, and it tells you that you failed. Now, assuming you've played GoldenEye, some of this might sound familiar to you. While it's true that Bond's missions were similarly structured, including various objectives to complete, it's when you look at the finer details that you realize how unpolished it is. Take, for instance, a similar situation to that explosive thing. In the second level of GoldenEye, the game asks you to make contact with a buddy and then blow up these containers of poison gas. Seeing in the intro of the game how it's supposed to be done, I knew I would need to use the mines that were provided. So, of course, I wasted all of my mines at the start of the level, and alas, the game never told me I failed. Then a firefight ensued. These containers can be destroyed by bullets, but the game doesn't give you enough time to blow them all up this way while under fire before the leaking gas kills you. If your game is going to ask you to do trial and error, it kind of needs to let you know when you've goofed. That's why I'm saying it feels unfinished. The mission objective system isn't necessarily broken. I mean, technically it works on some level. It just isn't polished and isn't finished. Perfect Dark then takes this concept from GoldenEye and completes it. Sure, they're the same thing. One just included a status notification system that makes it usable and presentable. Another thing that Perfect Dark did very interestingly is difficulty. Most games these days, especially shooters, all employ the same sort of difficulty system. The harder a setting you select, the more health enemies have and the less you have. Bullets hurt them less and hurt you more. That's it. Some more ambitious games pair this to reward systems that depend on player performance, for example Resident Evil 4. And others try to avoid preset easy, medium, and hard modes altogether by using fully dynamic and automated difficulty systems, tailored to each player's specific skills. Most recently, Metal Gear Solid 5 tried to do this. Enemies in the early game will get new equipment based on the tactics that you employ. However, in the long term, this system proved to be too robust and poorly designed to actually impact player behavior. The goal was to force the player to modify their playstyle based on enemy countermeasures. But then enemies started being able to have all of their special equipment at once, and then they gave the player a way to disrupt shipments of that equipment very easily, essentially making it possible to strip all of the enemies clean, and wasting all of the tens of thousands of man-hours spent developing this difficulty system. All this is to say that even today, difficulty settings and systems are things that a lot of people either put no effort into, or design so poorly that they may as well have not put any effort into. Now, I didn't actually know how Perfect Dark handled difficulty until I came to the Chicago level. Chicago is a really small area with tons of little puzzles to solve within it. It all takes place on the corner of this dark, dreary street. So I began the level, made it past some dudes, checked my objectives, and took note of an interesting looking one. Create a vehicular diversion. So eventually I spot this limo. I figured that this must be the vehicle I have to use. I also noticed that this huge invincible laser shooting drone passes by it. So I thought there must be some puzzle to solve here. I observed the limo for a bit and noticed that after a while it takes off and flies away. After doing the first objective, which was to collect some equipment in a sewer, I noticed I was given a mine. I knew that my end goal was to enter the parking garage of a building nearby, and I wondered if placing a mine on the limo and then waiting for it to leave before detonating would allow access into the garage. But it didn't look like that's where the limo was headed. Then I thought since the drone passes by the limo, maybe the goal is to blow up the limo as it's close, destroying both of them. The likelihood of this being the solution was reinforced when I noticed a sewer pipe with a hole right under the limo, the perfect place to plant an explosive without anyone noticing. So I tried this. I put a mine on the limo, I left, I waited for the drone to pass by, I detonated, it exploded, and nothing happened. I got really confused here just thinking of all the possible ways to use that limo, but I couldn't figure out what the diversion was supposed to be. So I caved and I googled it. Perfect Dark Limo Puzzle. I started reading a guide and realized no, The diversion is done using a taxi instead. So what you do is you hack the taxi, which makes it fly off and crash into the drone, then attracting a large group of people who you take out and then you get into the garage. But something wasn't right. I wasn't satisfied with that. The limo's behavior was too interesting for it to just be decor. I was curious what role it played in the mission, if any. So I scrolled down a bit on the page and saw a whole other guide for the difficulty mode one higher than mine. I wasn't really sure what that meant. I just kind of assumed the difficulty in this game would be like the typical FPS affair, stronger bullets and weaker armor. But then I noticed that in this section, other objectives were listed. And then I got very, very interested. So interested, in fact, I finished my Star Fox coffee. Bet none of you noticed that, huh? I've been using this cup for a couple of videos, and nobody even commented on that. So, goes to show how much you guys care when I'm not talking about SpongeBob. So yes, the game does do the normal increasing damage stuff, as well as improving the quality of enemy AIs, making combat more challenging. But it also adds new and harder objectives into every mission. After all, the game isn't just about shooting, it's about being a spy, it's about solving puzzles. So a harder mode shouldn't just make it harder to kill people, it should also make your job as a secret agent more challenging. You have more stuff to do, more trial and error to complete. By the time you're able to beat a level, you know it inside and out, like a real spy. Additionally, the game's harder modes included different enemy placement and security cameras, tied together very well with the additional mission objectives. Now that you have more things to do, now that the path you'll take throughout a level is different, the placement of enemies and traps is also changed. Take the first mission, for example, which for the record, across the 3 difficulty modes goes from 1 objective to 4 and then 5. But anyways, the final objective unlocked, download the project files, is a really interesting one that shows how the additional objectives and increased mechanical difficulty aren't independent but work together. So the idea here is that there's a computer that you need to access to download some files, but to get in, you need a password. So you go around the level until you hear a dude on a phone call talking about the files that you need. You wait for him outside of the door to get off of his phone call. You hold him up, and then he freaks out and runs off looking for guards. Now, I love this mission, and I'm a pro. But if you didn't already kill all of the guards in the building, you'll fail the mission here. So then you get him, and you'll walk him to the computer where he needs to log in for you. As you'll notice, I'm passing by many destroyed security cameras. Again, that's because I'm a pro and I already shot them. But if you didn't know to take out the cameras ahead of time, if you didn't know that these cameras would be along your path to the computer, turning these corners would set off an alarm, spawning more guards and failing the mission. So then you get to the computer and tell him to log in. Here, I goofed. I wasn't really sure what I needed to do, so I just kind of waited until suddenly I was told that I failed the objective. Turns out the scrub deleted the files I needed, son of a gun. So after restarting, I listened to the phone call more carefully and realized he mentioned that he was about to delete the files. So the trick here, once you get him to the computer, is wait until he says, "All right, I'm in," then knock him out before he can delete the files. This single objective gives you 4 points of failure. If you either forget to take out all the guards, if you forget to take out all the cameras, if you wait too long to knock him out, or if you just kill him too early accidentally, you'll fail this mission goal and be unable to finish the level. This single part of the mission, this part 5 out of 5, has significant amount of risk and significant amount of weight. Now, these two things, increasing base enemy bullet damage and adding more complex objectives, these are both ideas introduced and implemented minimally in GoldenEye. GoldenEye's objectives just weren't able to be as complex as Perfect Dark due to the lack of voice acting. This whole event with the phone call guy, this would have been impossible in the James Bond game. One of my other favorite objectives in Perfect Dark is one very similar to this. It takes place in a mission on a tanker ship, the one that features Miyamoto as the first guard. So on medium difficulty, you have to turn off the ship's GPS or something. You go to where that is, and there are 3 pilots operating a circular machine. You walk in with your guns in, and you hold them up. If you walk up to one of them, you can command them to turn off the thing. But you've got to be smarter than me for a minute. This is a game that's been designed by people with an intended challenge in mind. If it was as simple as just walking up to somebody and telling them to do something, there would just be 1 pilot. So why are there 3 instead? Well, I'll tell you why. As soon as the one you pick begins deactivating the GPS, another will pull out a gun, screaming and calling them traitors before trying to kill them so that you can't turn it off. When this happens, you have to kill him before he takes them both out. As long as one is still alive, you can still shut down the thing and complete the objective. So the objectives aren't harder than those in GoldenEye, but they are more complex and they're coupled to harder combat. That's not all though. Perfect Dark does 2 other things with objectives that are unique to it from ya boy 007. Some easy mode mission objectives change drastically depending on your difficulty setting. For instance, in Area 51 Rescue, where you have to obtain and use a lab technician disguise. On easy mode, it's kind of given to you as soon as you enter the lab area. But on harder difficulties, you need to sneak around in your normal clothes for a while before finding it elsewhere. Even your available methods for entering the lab change based off different weapons being available. So that's one of the other things it does. Previous objectives that you've completed on lower difficulties now have different solutions to them in harder difficulties. Now the second thing, and this blew my freaking mind, but the way in which you solve certain puzzles or complete certain tasks can impact events in the preceding stages. On the airbase level, your final goal is to reach Air Force One with the stewardess disguise. Depending on how you entered the plane at the end of the level, you'll either start the next stage, Air Force One, in the middle level of the plane, or in the cargo bay. I crawled in from the landing gear, so I started in the cargo. I did this because in this room there's a hover bike, and if you lower the bike before completing the mission, you'll get to use it in the next mission after the plane crashes, which is extremely useful as it allows you to get around the place much faster and avoid confrontations with enemies. The downside to starting down here is that in the first room down is the only member of the flight crew who's able to recognize your disguise and alert guards to your presence. Starting from the middle allows you to avoid that guy and head straight to your first objective, which is to locate the president. But here's the catch. That only works on easy mode. See, on the medium mode of the level before the airplane, the airbase level, there's a metal detector that'll ruin your mission if you walk through it with all of your guns and the recording that you need to give the president in the next level. So halfway through the stage, you have to put all of your guns in a briefcase, put the briefcase on a conveyor belt, and then make a mad dash to the security system room to knock out the dudes there and turn off the luggage scanner before your case gets caught. Because in the medium mode version of the airbase stage, you end without any of your guns, you start the next mission on the plane without any equipment. Your briefcase with the evidence inside was taken from the conveyor belt to the cargo bay. To complete this mission on medium mode, you'll have to go to the cargo bay anyways to get your briefcase, meaning that a different entry point on the plane in the previous level is now favored over the one from the other, easier difficulty setting. Here's a fun challenge to do at home while I drink coffee. Think of a single other game that does anything like this! Bonus points if it came out within the same decade as Perfect Dark. That'll be freaking hard. There are many really interesting points in the game like these really cool and complex objectives that impact future levels. So to avoid spoilers, I'm not going to really talk about any others. You really need to try this game yourself. So at this point you should probably understand how Perfect Dark didn't just take all of these elements from GoldenEye single player and polish them up, but it also expanded upon them. It added new things to them. What if I told you though that the expansion doesn't end there? What if I told you that the single player wasn't actually single player at all? Perfect Dark, and I feel the need to remind you this, released in 2000, has a campaign that is playable in a total of 4 different ways. You can play it alone, like you're seeing here, but you can also play it cooperatively with a friend in split screen, the entire game. Suffice to say that at the time, not many FPS games implemented features like this so seamlessly. Now, here's the really cool part. Even if you didn't have a buddy, you could still play co-op with an AI-controlled partner. That's what you're seeing footage of here. This is Velvet Dark, the basic partner for co-op, but there are others you can unlock if you care. 9 years before Resident Evil 5 came out, Perfect Dark implemented a co-op campaign system better than it. As you should remember, one of the biggest issues with Resident Evil 5 was the mandatory AI partner, which was a nuisance and got in the way during missions. Playing alone gave you added responsibilities because the partner was crap. In this game though, the campaign was designed with single player in mind, but could optionally be played with a partner, manual or automated. And instead of being a pain to look after, the AI partner was given special abilities, making playing with them a different experience from playing with a human friend. It can do melee attacks that the player can't do. It can roll and dodge enemy attacks. It's crazy. And if it dies, it dies. It doesn't really matter. You can keep on playing yourself. So it's not just the same partner but AI controlled, it behaves completely differently. Also, the partner's behavior can be toggled between aggressive and defensive, just like Resident Evil 5. But more interestingly, some of the other partners you can unlock have entirely different behavior. I like Velvet though because she's guard-like. She has no fear. She's a straight-up, cold-blooded predator. So attentive viewers who've done first grade math might have realized that that's just 3 ways you can play. You can play single player, you can play cooperatively with a friend, or you can play cooperatively with an AI. And what about the 4th way? The 4th way, that yes, the entire game is playable in, is something that they called counter-operatively. Perfect Dark actually coined this term, the opposite of co-op. And sadly, it's a term that we never really hear much of today because nobody does it. In the year 2000, Rare built a game that featured an asymmetrical 2-player challenge mode. Literally the entire idea behind the Wii U. One player plays the game's protagonist with the goal of completing the mission's objectives, while the other takes control of random enemies around the level and is tasked with killing their friend. Whatever weapons or equipment the enemy they've possessed has, that's all they have at their disposal, as well as a suicide pill which allows them to give up their current body and take over another one. Think of a really intense 1v1 match between two players, but within the context of a mission, and where one player is a heavily armed and powerful character trying to complete a scavenger hunt, and the other is a weaker opponent with multiple lives. I'm sorry, by the way, the footage of this stuff is pretty bad, so you're just gonna have to use your imagination for some of these things. I speak from experience though. My brother and I used to play this mode a lot as kids. The challenge isn't super shallow or one-sided though. Obviously, giving the opposing character so many attempts seems imbalanced. So if player 1 actually manages to kill all of the enemies in an area, leaving none left for player 2 to assume the roles of, a new enemy is spawned at the beginning of the level, and the opposing player needs to make their way all the way there to where the protagonist is before being able to engage them, giving the first player a feeling of constantly being hunted down, of being stalked. That is, of course, if you play this mode competitively. See, counter-operative can totally be played cooperatively, and that's what my brother and I used to do a lot. I would be the counter-operative, but I'd play like a secret agent. I'd move ahead disguised as an enemy, relaying intel to my brother, who would later storm the area as I assisted him by taking out my fellow guards alongside him. It was really cool that you could play this way. I mean, it's not like this wasn't an intended use case. Why else would friendly fire on enemies be featured in the game? They must have known kids would do this. It was a really cool mode that nobody does anymore, with like the exception of those Nintendo Land minigames and one of the Resident Evil 5 DLC mercenary modes. Now, at the beginning of this video, I started with a question about GoldenEye. The thing though is that despite it having a fairly long story mode, the aspect of that game that everyone remembers is the multiplayer. I'm willing to take a bet that in your eyes, GoldenEye is probably the definitive 4-player first-person shooter party mode experience for the N64. As with everything else though, a fresh look at it reveals how minimal and unfinished it really was, as well as how far Perfect Dark was able to take it. An unnecessary addition to the entire mission list being playable in multiple multiplayer ways, Perfect Dark didn't just contain a 4-player mode similar to GoldenEye, but, you know, with all of its mechanical extensions like secondary weapon functions and gadgets and stuff. No, Perfect Dark didn't do that. It included a multiplayer suite able to support a maximum of 9 players with tons of modifications and preset game types available. You see, a big part of Perfect Dark's development went into character AI. In GoldenEye, most of the enemy characters had extremely simple behavior. They would often either hold their ground and fire or walk directly towards you and attack, using some basic pathfinding techniques to traverse the mission stages and follow the player, their target. This sort of AI worked well for the game's missions, but couldn't be adapted or ported into the multiplayer mode. The sorts of AI logic you need for that sort of combat situation are very different from those in the main game. That's why you could only play multiplayer with other human players. For Perfect Dark, a better and more intelligent AI system was produced, not only for multiplayer, but for missions as well. I mean, aside from really intelligent AI spawning throughout the levels, always keeping you on your toes, the actual behavior of the bots had a lot of effort spent on it. In the multiplayer mode titled Combat Simulator, which unlike GoldenEye could be accessed even when a single controller was plugged in, bots named simulants, a nice little nod to Blade Runner, could be added to a match and would behave properly no matter the type. From deathmatch to capture the flag and all other unlockable modes in between, the sims interacted with each other and human players within the context of a game's rules and objectives. Now, using the word simulant to describe your multiplayer bots in a game that has perfect in the title might sound a little bit cocky. At the end of the day, they're really just cannon fodder, right? They're just like an optional buffer included to speed up the chemical reactions between players, right? Well, it would be if the simulant behavior had a single depth level to it. So yeah, you can select the difficulty of each sim in a match from the list of Meat Sim, Easy Sim, and Normal Sim. This choice affects things like their reaction time, their accuracy, and their decision making when it comes to selecting weapons. Oh yeah, did I mention that developers designed all weapons to have advantages and disadvantages when compared to other weapons, like a giant game of rock, paper, scissors with 35 options times 2 because of secondary functions? I mean, even the freaking karate chops have another functionality as a disarm. Yo, this game is bananas! Like, okay, I know I haven't spent a single point talking about just how interesting secondary weapon functions are, but that's because it would basically boil down to me just citing a bunch of examples of all of the cool and unique gun abilities, effectively spoiling a bunch of the game's gameplay. Because, like, it's cool to get a new gun and figure out what it does, but also because I feel like just saying, hey, every gun actually does 2 things, not 1, okay, bye, is kind of sufficient to get my point across. Primarily because even today, I can't think of a single other game where every gun is actually 2 guns. And like sometimes completely unrelated guns. You freaking walk up to a dude and you see he's holding a dragon assault rifle, but you don't know what mode he's got it in. Does he have it in the regular rapid fire mode? Or does he have it in the proximity mine mode? And is he about to throw it at you like a grenade? No joke, this gun can be used 3 ways. You can shoot people, you can throw it at them like a bomb, or you can drop it somewhere only for someone to blow up when they try to pick it up. Look, I just said I wasn't gonna do it and I did it, yeah, I hate myself. So the base difficulty is only your first choice when setting up a sim. Your second choice though is its behavior. Rather than being in a bot match with a bunch of generic enemies, you can choose what sort of personality you'd like them all to have. And the choices available make the game really interesting. So for instance, you've got the Prey Sim, who will only attack enemies that are at a disadvantage. It'll hunt people that are low on health and have no shields, have just respawned, or have worse guns than it does. Then to counter that, you've got the Judge Sim, who's all about punishing players who exhibit prey-like behavior, including actual prey sims, but also human players who act like them. Focusing your attention on the weak will land the judge's eye on you. A really fun one is the Venge Sim, who will always place a target on the back of whichever player last killed it, stopping at nothing until it's killed them or it's been killed, making you kind of weary to attack it. It actually won't pull the trigger on anyone other than its last killer. So if you see one walking around and it's not shooting at you, better to just stay back and let it do its thing. A modified version of this is the Feud Sim, who picks a single enemy randomly at the beginning of the game and focuses its efforts on killing them and only them throughout the entire duration of the match, ignoring other objectives but defending itself when necessary. And there are also sim personalities that aren't offensive. My favorite being the Peace Sim, whose goal is to slow down the fight for everyone. It frequently evades enemies, but if attacked, it'll try to disarm players and leave with their guns, then moving on to collect other guns and ammo around the stage before anyone else can. The cool thing is that if you actually manage to kill a Peace Sim, well, happy birthday, you get to take all of the stuff it's been stockpiling. There are a bunch of really interesting sim personalities available, and they all add a lot to the combat simulator when playing alone, but also make playing with friends much more fun. Also, on top of their behavior being selectable, you can issue commands to them when you're on their team. It's really good. It goes above and beyond what you minimally need for a game like this. It goes back to the development environment. They weren't trying to make a product that you could sell, they were just making things that they thought were cool and would work. I apologize again, the footage here won't reflect what I'm saying, but in the same way that GoldenEye was a lot of people's go-to multiplayer game, Perfect Dark was ours at my house. I remember once specifically, all the cousins came over for a name day. You see, Greeks do this really weird thing where they hold parties on the days dedicated to certain saints if anybody in the family has the name of that saint. Whether it's your first name or your middle name or your last name somehow matches. We also have this other tradition which imposes some consequences on this, which is that they name all of their children after their parents. So if you're a son, you're named after your father's father, and if you're a daughter, you're named after your mother's mother. Which is why after a couple of generations, there's a lot of the same names, a lot of Dennis's, Nick's, Yanni's, John's, Alex's, stuff like that. Also, middle names come from relatives, so your middle name normally is the first name of someone else in your family. Sometimes even parents will pass their first names as the middle name of their child. So like I'll get a phone call randomly from my dad and he'll be like, hey, what's going on? I'll be like, hey, what's up? And he'll be like, happy name day for your middle name. And I'll be like, oh, thanks, I didn't know. Happy name day for your first name, I guess. And he'll be like, yeah, thanks. I'll be like, oh, great. It's really just an excuse for family to get together, I guess. It was a big deal in our family, at least because a lot of us were named Dennis, evidently. And the Saint Dionysios of Zakynthos, comes from Zakynthos, which is where our family came from. So it kind of had a special significance on our family. So if it landed on a weekend, we'd have a party. Also, it doesn't help that there's like 2 St. Dennises. So anyways, I bring this up because imagine trying to play a game with like a million very loud and very violent Mediterranean kids all amped up on sugar. You know, just because it says game over on the screen doesn't mean the beating is done. So anyways, at this one party, we were having a little bit of trouble with that. We were playing a couple of games and all the cousins started biting at each other's throats. So then my brother had the great idea of pulling out Perfect Dark, plugging in 4 controllers, and setting up a custom match of Capture the Flag 4 humans against 4 Sims. That night, we must have played Perfect Dark for hours. It was such a freaking blast. Just taking turns and swapping out every match, changing up the weapons, which, by the way, unlike GoldenEye, you had complete control over. It wasn't just presets, and even voting on which types of sims would get into the next round. It was like whoever got the best score in the previous game would get to choose their favorite weapons to put into the next match and their favorite types of sims. I remember we all like doing this thing where we'd put in a feud sim all the time, and we'd try to like place bets on who would get selected by it, and then we'd like defend them. We'd always like follow them and stuff like that. It was like really weird, goofy stuff that only kids would do. Like, yeah, it was a first-person shooter. Yeah, it could fulfill a competitive player's desires, but it could also serve as a fun party game. The weapons were zany, the game modes were team-based. You could have everyone in the room on the same team. You could do 2 human versus 2 human with simulant teammates that each team could choose the behavior of. It was so complex, it was so accessible, modifiable, reusable. It was a banger of a game. This image is just like burned into my mind, like a room full of kids huddled around a tiny screen, just chilling, telling stories, passively playing Perfect Dark. That's what I think of when I think of games. This sort of gathering of people. Little did any of us know, though, that even over a decade later, few games would ever be created that could support the sort of experience we were having that night. No game, I believe, since Perfect Dark has ever been as complex as it, polished and focused, while also offering as many different ways to play and have fun, at least not within the genre of first-person shooters. That's why I'm showing you today the N64 version of the game, not the rare replay remakes or anything. At the time this version of this game was released, it was as good as it possibly could be. Perfect Dark on the N64 could not have possibly been any better given its environment and context. From hugely complex and well-implemented game design decisions to little aesthetic things like being one of the first FPS games to have super detailed reloading animations. This game pushed not only its software and hardware to new performance limits, but it also appended and concatenated concepts and ideas to and between the definitions of multiple genres it borrowed ideas from. Hey, let's make probably the best AI within the context of games anyone has ever made up to this point. And then, let's scan people's faces and put them in the game. And then, let's build puzzle and adventure game challenges into it and have players solve them through the interface of an FPS. It's crazy to me to think of some of the sentences that must have been thrown around during the creation of this game. This wasn't just development, this was research and development. Sadly though, despite all the innovating and genre redefinition they were doing, when the game finally came out, not many people were there to read their definitions. Maximizing the quality of their final product with their given environmental constraints unfortunately wasn't enough to fully mitigate the impacts of that environment. After all this talk about Perfect Dark, you're probably wondering why you never played it or never even heard of it, why you played so much GoldenEye instead. But that's because, truth be told, you didn't have as much time to play Perfect Dark as you did GoldenEye. The game came out in 2000, which was just a year before the GameCube was released, and that was kind of occupying a lot of the attention of Nintendo gamers. It was because the game, unlike GoldenEye, was rated M for mature. Your parents probably didn't want to get it for you if you were my age at the time. I mean, the only reason I got to play it was because my brother had it. It's probably because it was 2000 and the main playable character in the game was a woman, something that, yeah, at the time you didn't see all that much, especially cases where they weren't overtly sexualized. One of the aesthetic things that the developers were proud of was giving the character changes of clothes depending on the mission. She's dressed pretty appropriately for all of the situations she's in. She basically never wears anything that a female James Bond or Solid Snake wouldn't. This gets brought up in conversation about the game from time to time, and I'm bringing it up because I think it deserves to be acknowledged. I mean, even as a young kid, often playing Player 2 to my brother's Player 1, I always thought that this Velvet Dark character was kind of weird looking. These days, things have changed, obviously, for the better. I could only find one study on the impact of protagonist gender on the success of games that explicitly references Perfect Dark. It makes the conclusion that it doesn't have a significant effect. But they didn't actually use sales numbers, instead judging a game's success on whether or not it had a sequel, which Perfect Dark did. When you look into it though, Perfect Dark Zero, the sequel they cite as an indication of success, a game that was not as subtle about their character being a girl, it sold even worse. I don't think that sort of reception can be considered a success. A better comparison is to GoldenEye, the game that featured James Bond. It's also because Perfect Dark, having all of the unpreceded and unmatched scope and vision that it did, was unable to run all of its processes on the 4 megabytes of RAM available on the N64. As a result, a consumer would need to purchase an N64 RAM expansion pack to be able to access the entire game. Without this, only a small bare-bones version of the multiplayer was available. Despite the game's content being so diverse and complex, offering tons of replay value and practically future-proofing itself, the way by which the game had to be accessed was not. This is why the footage you've been seeing throughout this video comes from emulation. Finding a first-party N64 expansion pack that is unused and doesn't cost hundreds of dollars these days is nigh impossible. Third-party ones are either a hit or a miss. You read ratings and reviews only to see people reporting tons of problems, in some cases claiming overheating and damage to their consoles. I currently am the proprietor of 2 N64s, and I'd like to keep it that way. The expansion pack we used to use for Perfect Dark was sold many years ago along with a lot of the games we had. When I got my hands on a new copy, I forgot about the whole RAM situation. I did manage to get one. I'm not sure what the make is. I don't even remember the box it came in. I don't even remember if it was used or not. I remember paying between $30 to $40 Canadian. Here's the problem though. From a preservationist stance, it would be wrong to even risk putting this thing in my N64. Like, it's not like it's licensed by Nintendo. It's not like it was even manufactured while the N64 was still relevant. You're talking like cheap knockoffs with this sort of stuff. I'm heavily against doing anything to a console that would void its warranty were it still relevant. Further, there's another video production related risk that I wasn't comfortable taking. As you might know, most old cartridges save your game's progress in volatile memory maintained by a battery. These batteries die though. Since so much of the stuff I wanted to talk about in Perfect Dark was further into the game's progression and at multiple difficulty levels, I wasn't able to risk losing a save file during a couple of sessions of footage capture. I already found a copy of Pokemon Red that lost its memory, so I've seen this happen. I mean, people discuss the ethics of emulation a lot, and in most cases I agree that it should be avoided. However, when there are risks involved in running the original version of a piece of software, when the hardware your software is stored on is actually volatile, constantly deteriorating, and since it's been almost 2 decades since that piece of plastic and metal came out of a factory line, I don't think there's too much of an issue with emulating. I mean, I have the game, that's one thing, but to someone else, to someone who wants to play this for the first time, telling them that the only way they're allowed to do it is by paying more money than it originally costed to take something that is potentially volatile, that will potentially damage a historical piece of machinery just to run it. I think asking that of a person, of a consumer, of someone who just wants to experience an old game, I think that's unethical. But yeah, asking people to pay more money for a mandatory memory expansion to play a mature game without a known character like James Bond just a year before a new console, that's kind of sketch. Doesn't matter how phenomenal a game is. Its success, its sales are going to take a blow for this. These are the reasons that GoldenEye sold over 8 million copies, whereas Perfect Dark just sold over 2.5. Still, funnily enough, more than the makers themselves expected, so. Now, what I think is the saddest thing about the game's lackluster market performance is that it disallowed Perfect Dark from having the sort of impact on games and on the public that other arguably objectively inferior games, like GoldenEye, were able to have, and did in fact have. See, the thing about games is that they aren't just technology, like my typical criticisms of them might imply I think they are. But they also aren't just entertainment or media. You can't compare games to a technology like a corkscrew which has a single intended purpose. Games are huge things with influences coming towards and away from them in all directions. Whether or not you believe it, games, automated or otherwise, are sociotechnical systems. It's easy not to look at them like this, and yes, it's not required in criticism sometimes, but they are. Games have impacts on various technological and societal entities, as well as receive effects from them. Games and the industry that surrounds them aren't self-contained. Not all technologies that go into games are made in-house, or are even made by game companies. The distribution and production of games is regulated for societal, political, and cultural reasons, in some countries and eras more than others. Some governments, for example mine, subsidize game development. This is why it's important to receive these games within the context of their environments. Why, for example, the date of a game's publishing matters when discussing its quality.
That was for our fallen brothers.
Why, for example, when reviewing something like the SpongeBob movie game, it's important to receive it within the context of the games that came before it. If it had just existed on its own, the problems with it wouldn't be as huge, but the fact that the problems from it arise from taking things that worked and changing them in ways that didn't match the design of the challenges, that's a bigger deal. You can be harsh for that reason, because of the environment that the SpongeBob movie game came from. Which is also fair considering what I hear a lot. Hey, they only had a year to make the game. It doesn't take a year to just copy stuff that worked and just keep that and not change it to trash. That's kind of the point of that whole video. This is all I'm ever gonna say about SpongeBob ever again, hopefully. If games were just machines or toys, you could disqualify things like time or context from the equation. A train that makes sounds and releases smoke will always be better than one made of wood. A game is not a toy. It's not a corkscrew. Its creation and existence are tied to the society and culture that initially received it. You have to recognize and acknowledge that when discussing them. Otherwise, you're not discussing them. You're discussing the technical side of a socio-technical system.
More and more, I find myself wondering if it's all worth fighting for. For a future without...
The SpongeBob movie game...
Yeah, it's worth it.
Like any other tech, a standout product sets a standard for all others to copy. There are innovators, there are knockoffs. Tech influences other tech. Why do all shooters control the same these days? One of the greatest ways to make a banging game is to look at others that are well received. I mean, on a more interesting level, people who make games as adults are often people who played games as kids. Same thing with film or literature or music or whatever. Designers are inspired by the games they played in childhood. These ideas are carried with them. The problem is that Perfect Dark wasn't a part of many people's childhoods. Nobody really paid any attention to it. It wasn't accessible enough, it was expensive, it was poorly timed. Perfect Dark's quality in literally all aspects of its being were more than worthy of being an inspiration to games developed in the next generation. Instead, everyone remembered GoldenEye, took influence from it, placed it down as a baseline, and tried to move forward from there, even though that's literally what Perfect Dark had already done, and better, and by the same people. A lot of first-person shooters tried to be their generation's GoldenEye. Everyone wanted to be the maker of the next GoldenEye. Arguably, though sacrificing local for networked multiplayer, Call of Duty won. Meanwhile, Perfect Dark sitting alone being played in a house full of Greeks, Perfect Dark was the one that really got it. Perfect Dark didn't make any sacrifices. In many ways, Call of Duty and other modern first-person shooters like it meet the base requirements of a GoldenEye-like experience, but come nowhere close to a Perfect Dark-like one. Not only was Perfect Dark an actual, literal improvement over GoldenEye, it did things that were ahead of its time. Playing this game again as an adult, you'll have to keep reminding yourself of how old it is. Okay, so the main menu of the game takes place in the player's secret base, populated by a couple of other characters and literally the most functional doors in gaming. I remember just kind of thinking it was like a goofy way to access the training challenges, and was probably just an excuse to have the game not boot up to a menu screen. I was completely wrong though, it's totally intentional. It prepares you for a mission that actually takes place in this building towards the end of the game. I'm not going to show you for spoiler reasons, but the idea is that if you've explored the place before, it gives you a serious advantage in that mission, which otherwise is a real pain to figure out. The only other game I can think of that has done anything remotely similar is Metal Gear Solid 5, which came out 15 years later and did it poorly. I know a bit about what my audience demographics are, and I know that this game is older than a lot of you. This is the sort of top-notch software people were working full-time jobs producing while you didn't even exist yet. And nobody's done it since, as of y'all showing up, so yeah, I blame you guys, all of you. You all suck. Oh yeah, cool partner stuff like Resident Evil 5. Oh wait, this happened 9 years earlier. Oh, a cool combat simulation mode like the combat training in Call of Duty Black Ops 1 and 2, except much more meaningfully complex with custom AIs and more interesting weapons that all balance each other out. Oh, and also the AIs can play various different game modes, whereas in COD they can only play basic deathmatch types. How much had AI advanced in 10 years? Must have been more than enough to not have to scope down from a game that literally ran on 2/1000ths. 2/1000ths of the memory your game needs to operate. You know, people poop on the new Star Wars Battlefront a lot, but I was impressed that they actually made bots that could play non-deathmatch modes. They're still just bots though, not simulants. They're nowhere near worthy of deserving a Blade Runner reference. But speaking of Blade Runner, that's what I'm trying to say. Unlike the game, Blade Runner became a cult classic fairly quickly after its initially rocky start. And look at the impact it's had on sci-fi in all forms of media. Blade Runner was a different type of sci-fi. Tons of other films, tons of games, tons of ideas owe it credit. It took visions of the future into a whole new direction, well respected as one of the most overall impactful pieces of media of the sci-fi genre, which it absolutely deserves. Similarly, Perfect Dark's creative direction had the capacity to have such an impact on the genre of first-person shooters. But it didn't for no fault of its own. I wholeheartedly believe that if Perfect Dark had been released under different circumstances, gaming today would be completely different. I'm saying imagine the genre of sci-fi in an alternate reality where Blade Runner never existed. That's what I think we're in with games and shooters. We're living in some crappy alternate version of a world where Perfect Dark should have been GoldenEye. Perfect Dark is worth your attention, whether you're just a player or a hopeful. It has been for 17 years and will continue to be until another FPS draws serious inspiration from it and isn't time splitters, and finds a way to expand upon the sort of stuff it did. Shooter bot AI development has been almost stagnant since developers found ways to connect players together, reducing their efforts in challenge design. Things like this need to be improved though, because they can offer challenges human players alone can't. The popularity of wave-based survival games is evidence of interest, proof that friends like teaming up against bots. Look at the leap between James Bond's single-player only bots and Perfect Dark's multi-purpose and portable simulants. This was 3 years of technological progress in games. This was 3 years 17 years ago. Nobody has topped the base interestingness and functionality of preset personalities, except maybe Metabots. But they haven't because they haven't started from here. Hey, take all these machine learning techniques, take the amiibo stuff, don't chuck them, but start from this. Start from these basic profiles. Don't start from scratch. Don't reinvent the wheel. It's already been done. Just open your eyes. In closing, Perfect Dark is a really good game. Go tell your mom. Hello and welcome to the Endscreen! What up? So this Endscreen, I actually have some specific things I want to talk about. This was I finished the video, right? Okay, thank God. Whew. It's like 3 o'clock in the morning, I gotta go to bed. So as some of you might be aware, depending on how much we communicate, whether it's Discord, Twitter, whatever, I have a couple of personal things that are gonna be keeping me busy for a little while, so I don't know when I'll really be able to begin production on the next video. Oh, I found a chair that doesn't creak, so I'm using this from now on. Works good. Though I don't even know if this is where I'll be filming the next video, so it doesn't really matter. I'll just steal this chair. Over the course of last year during school, and up to this summer when I started, I had 7 ideas, well actually 8 ideas for videos I wanted to do, like partially formed ideas. But then Breath of the Wild came out and that kind of complicated things. So of those 8, the only I've done were the movie game, I did motion controls in Call of Duty 4 on the Wii, and I did Perfect Dark finally. Originally it was just going to be about difficulty, but then I started doing more research and this kind of turned into this whole thing. I kind of wanted to just do a big retrospective ode to Perfect Dark, and I wanted to introduce the concept of the sociotechnical system to you guys, because I feel like that's going to be something that comes up in the future. I feel like that's a lot of what I do, is like I'm setting down like baseline knowledge so that I can use it in the future with you guys, because it always sucks to have to bring in like a really complicated thing. So for full transparency, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just kind of describe the remaining 5 ideas that were partially formed, explain them a little bit, and just kind of hear from you guys in the comments or on Discord or on Twitter, wherever the heck you want to reach me, what seems more interesting to you. Also, I realized you look really like ungenuine when you're covering your eyes and speaking, but like I'm very, maybe I'll do this. How's that? This is funny. There's a funny story behind this. None of you would ever know it, but I know that some of my old friends from high school still watch some of my videos. If any of you guys remember this, like text me or something, like tell me that you remembered this, because there's a really very short but very interesting story behind how I acquired this. So without further ado, the 5 topics, I wrote a little bit about them. Okay, so in no particular order. One of them was about Pokemon. More specifically, the earlier Pokemon games and how they were unfair due to how they specifically implemented random number generation. Which, to be honest, I don't know much about the environment of development back then, so I don't know if that was really the best they could do, but the way they did it really makes the game unfair. So I kind of wanted to make a whole video explaining that if anybody's interested. Reverse engineering is completely legal in Canada. The second one was, I talked to a couple of people, they were interested. It was about school. So again, as some of you may know, I just recently graduated, got my bachelor's, having a good time. And yeah, I'm a gamer, I talk about games a lot, I talk about software a lot, yeah, that's fun. But one thing I have been for much longer is a student. I've been a student for basically my entire life. And I was kind of thinking of doing something, I wasn't sure in what format, even if it was just going to be a piece of writing, just some sort of retrospective on school, maybe collaborated with a couple of people that I've met along the way. I think you call them friends. But yeah, I was thinking of something like, because, you know, at least on Discord a lot, people come to me with questions about school. People ask specific questions about courses they should take. People ask about the direction I took. People ask me for advice with the direction they're trying to take. People look to me for educational resources from time to time. So I think it's, you know, I mean, as someone who's just finished, I think I have a little bit of insight into education, and it wouldn't just be higher level, it wouldn't just be university. Honestly, gonna start from like elementary school level all the way to higher ed, with just thoughts about the sorts of things I experienced, maybe a couple of personal stories, and definitely obviously like advice, but you know, take it with a grain of salt. It's just what I did. You probably will have a different experience. The third one, also not focused on a specific game, is about games as hobbies. Except the thing is, in that piece it would be a little bit different because my audience would not be you guys. So I was thinking of doing some sort of piece where I explain gaming to people of an older generation. You constantly hear stuff like this where, you know, kids are really into gaming, and they're not just into gaming, they're into creative hobbies that they're into as a result of gaming, and their parents just don't get it. I've been in that situation myself. You could argue that I still am, I guess. But I came up with this idea after I had kind of had like a couple of successful conversations with older people who had never really spent a minute contemplating games, never spent a thought on games. I had a couple of successful conversations where I was able to get them to understand certain gaming things and really understand how huge it is. And a big part of gaming is not gaming. A part of it was going to be kind of comparing hobbies of older generations. A lot of older people don't really have hobbies. All they kind of do is watch TV. And they say that of their children. All they do is game. But the thing about gaming is that it's a different hobby. It pushes you to do other things. Most of the time when you're a gamer, you also do other things related to games. Whether you're just gaming socially with your friends, or you're creating artwork based off your games, or you're creating little, you know, source filmmaker videos, or you're doing little machinimas, or you're doing game analysis, game critique, game review. So many people who play games become reviewers independently. Like, it's crazy. And as a result of that, they learn different skills like video editing. I mean, I learned to video edit because I was mimicking cutscenes from video games. That's what I did. Video games pushed me to learn creative skills. It's like, and that's something that for some reason they don't like. They can acknowledge that, oh, you know, you could do these things, but they don't relate it back to games. They don't realize that gaming is the source. So maybe, hey, I can imagine a kid who's just like, hey mom, dad, leave me alone when I'm playing my games because you're proud of the other stuff I do, but it's because of the game. Anyways, that video would be kind of like that. Another one is a complete ripoff of What's With Games. It would be kind of a parody of his style if I can get that working. The video would be called What's With Testing, and we talk about testing within the context of games but also outside of it. It'd be like the typical sort of stuff I do where I introduce a computer science or software engineering related thing and then I explain how it applies to games. I would talk a little bit about my experience as a manual game tester when I was a kid. That's my job. But a lot of it would really focus on automated testing. Another one is one I've wanted to do for a while, which is kind of like a retrospective sort of second looking at The Last of Us. So the first Last of Us video, you know, some people enjoyed it. I think I made some pretty decent points. Some of my opinions have changed about the game. You can blame that on the Nova Canoe if you know what I mean. But others haven't, and there were a couple of things that I wanted to do after that video anyways. A couple of thoughts I had as soon as the video was done that I kind of told myself I should have said this. Anyways, I think that's enough for today's video. This is one of the longest scripts I've written in a while. 18 pages. Mind you, one of those pages is the end screen because I actually did partially script the end screen. I ended up not even doing it, whatever. Oh, also, you might have noticed this shirt. This is the Breath First shirt. I designed a couple new shirts. I've also purchased all of my shirts except for one, but I have been purchasing them, and I can now vouch for Spreadshirt. The quality of these shirts is actually like really good. Basically at the same level as Redbubble, just much cheaper. I wasn't really sure how the revenue sharing for shirts worked on Spreadshirt, but all of them now I think they're like at the minimal amount of money for me, so they're like at the cheapest possible price right now, which I think is $17 American for the shirt that I'm wearing, and that's like 20 something dollars Canadian, which is, or maybe like 19, I don't know. But yeah, they're pretty cheap now, and I'm actually pretty impressed. Like, and as the creator of the shirts myself, I get them at a discount, so it's really cheap shirts that I get to make myself. It's a lot of fun. Thank you for dropping by another video that's not SpongeBob related and will probably never get as much attention as anything else I produce, but hey, you know what, whatever. It's not like I care. It's not like I just cry every night that nobody cares about all of the things I want to say and I want them to care about. You know, who cares? I'm just gonna leave. Peace, boy! One of these days, I'm really gonna snap. One of these days, I'm gonna snap. Oh, is it still recording? Crap, I can't tell that.